Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this NACD webinar on director compensation and more broadly, topics for the boardroom by the board of directors. My name is Jerry Isbell, and I will be your moderator today. And I'd like to welcome both from Pearl Meyer, Ryan Howerhan and Tim Dupuy. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mary from NACD for some housekeeping items.
Thanks so much, Jerry. Can we go to the next slide, please? And one more. Great. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to NACD's webinar. We're so excited that you're here with us. And Jerry, thank you so much for agreeing to join us and be our board director voice. I'd like to get through a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. For our audience, we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to submit your questions by adding them into the Q&A webinar portal. We've built in a little bit of Q&A time in the end, but would love to address your questions throughout. So please feel free to drop those in. And if for some reason we can't get to your question today, we'll go ahead and send your question over along with your email address to our friends at Pearl Meyer so that they can respond to you directly via email in the next couple of days. The number one question that we always get is whether or not this webinar and the slides will be available after the webinar. We will have those ready for you. It says here that it'll be available today, but I heard just that it was early next week that we'll have those for you. So keep an eye out on these two links for the webinar and the slides. As always, a recording of the webinar will be available on both nacdonline.org/webinars and at pearlmeyer.com. You can also access the presentation slides and some great thought leadership resources that Pearl Meyer has provided in the additional resources section and in your post-webinar emails. Moving to the next slide, I just want to remind our certified directors and board director fellows that your participation today earns you credit towards maintaining your NACD credentials. NACD fellows and certified directors will automatically receive 1 credit for their participation. Please note that you must attend this webinar for at least 50 minutes to receive that credit. And speaking of our NACD Director Certification Program, if you're interested in learning more about this and setting yourself apart as a high performance director, this is a great designation to do that. So check out our webpage or contact your membership advisor at credentialing@nacdonline.org. Also, we will have some polling questions for those of you who are looking for NASPA credits. You must answer 2 of the 3 polling questions to receive your credit. Finally, we have a few evaluation questions in the follow-up email for the program and would appreciate your feedback. You'll see this both in post-webinar as well as in the post-webinar email. We hope you'll provide us the insight that we need to make these webinars really great for you. So on that note, Ryan, do you want to take it ahead for us?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out today to join this webinar. Jerry, special thanks to you for the additional expertise that you're bringing to the table. But the focus of the conversation today is really going to be around, all things director compensation related, largely, leveraged out of the latest NACD director compensation report. You can go to the next slide. We're going to start off by just giving kind of a holistic view of the environment that directors are facing today. This shouldn't come as a major surprise to those individuals on the call, but I think, and Jerry, I'd certainly welcome your opinion at the end of this slide in terms of what you're seeing. But from our perspective at Pearl Meyer, we're certainly seeing the complexity and time commitment associated with board membership increasing significantly due to expanding remit that includes oversight in areas that, a few years ago weren't necessarily at the top of the agenda. Some of those being ESG, environmental, social governance. That's been in play for a little while. I think boards are starting to get their feet under them a little bit more on the ESG side. Diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. Again, we're seeing companies get a little bit more traction, I believe, under their belt on DEI, as this has been a pertinent topic at the board level for a couple years, but we're still seeing pressure on it. I think this next bullet is one that we've seen come to fruition more so over the last, let's say, 12 to 18 months, which is this idea of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, something that we're seeing an increased focus on at the board level, and quite frankly, a fairly finite skill set, meaning, there's just not that many well-versed directors that are also experts in either cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And then the final one, this idea of human capital, talent management, and leadership development. Again, the board's always kind of had a hand in succession planning at the senior most levels, but we're certainly seeing an added focus deeper in the organization around things like pay transparency, pay equality, all of those things that are now moving up to the remit of the board. Even though it might not be the focus, it's something that we are seeing creep onto agendas. I think with this added emphasis and kind of this evolving landscape, from Pearl Meyer's perspective, ensuring that the boards are agile enough to adapt and keep pace with shifting organizational needs is dependent on having directors with a robust mix of institutional knowledge, evolving experience and skills, and fresh insights. And what does that really speak to? Probably having a healthy process regarding board refreshment. We're certainly seeing things, mandatory retirement ages, in some cases, even 10-year requirements, meaning once you've served for more than, let's say, 7 years on the board, you're no longer, able to, based on a policy internal. Those are less common. But I think we're seeing an added emphasis on this idea of board refreshment under the pretense that there are new issues that are coming to light that, some of our more established, longstanding directors might not be completely proficient in. And those are some of those newer kind of, more technology-focused items that are starting to creep onto the agenda. Unfortunately for the directors, despite kind of this increased scrutiny around human capital management, DEI, ESG, more complex agendas, coupled with, I will say, greater competition, especially for, diverse candidates, as well as candidates that fit into kind of that cybersecurity or AI skill set. So even though we're seeing more competition for those types of directors, we've seen fairly modest year-over-year growth in director compensation. I keep saying this, and I think maybe it will eventually come to fruition. But I'm expecting going forward, we might start seeing a little bit more dichotomy in director compensation and companies starting to think about it more as a differentiator as these skill sets become more important for board service. But Jerry, I'll pause there and see, does this resonate with what you're seeing on your boards? And is there anything else outside of this that you're seeing creep on to the agenda that might not have been there a few years ago?
Ryan, I think this is absolutely correct. It feels like every year there's a ratcheting up of more things that are expected of us from a board level. And then what you decide to do within a committee or keep to the full board, I think is an important determination that is company specific and board specific. And as you alluded to, what the talent level is within the board and the expertise that each person brings is critically important on that. And it just feels like every year there's something more.
Yeah, and I certainly think you're also seeing this creep into, committee charters, right? I've had a lot of clients over the last, year or two say, Ryan, in light of some of these additional items under our purview, we probably need to take another look at the committee charter to make sure, we have the right constituents looking at the right items. And I will say it varies. I have companies where ESG sits at the comp committee. I have companies where ESG sits at nominating and governance. It's not a one size fits all approach, but I do think we are certainly seeing, an emphasis on making sure not only these items are on the agenda, but when you go back to kind of a governance perspective, that committee charters are also speaking to these items as well. I think that brings us to our first, actually, no, maybe not. Next slide, please. Oh, it does take us to our first poll question. So the first poll question that we're really looking to elicit feedback on is, to what extent is your board discussing cybersecurity and artificial intelligence strategies? You see the choices there kind of ranging from not at all, we'll let the senior management team handle that, to, this is a major focus on the board, or we've identified a specific committee to oversee these issues. It looks like the vast majority of respondents, and this isn't surprising, is, they're regularly discussed topics at the board level and with senior management, but we haven't necessarily identified a committee. I'm starting to see a little bit more B come into that, which, again, I would encourage anyone in the A and B bucket to start migrating to the C and D bucket. But it looks like the majority are, regularly discussed topics at board level, with senior management being privy to those conversations, but not necessarily, a designated committee to oversee those kind of things. Jerry, just curious, does that align with how you're seeing this play out?
It does. We're both of my boards, we're regularly talking about it with senior management. It's not, you really have to understand this from inside the company, how the management team is viewing it and how they're addressing these issues inside the company to keep the board informed about what's going on. If you're lucky enough to have someone on your board who is an expert in this, then fantastic for you and your board. But most of the time, you're either relying on senior management or, an outside consultant to come in and talk with the board. So it's critical that we all stay abreast on it. But it's hard to get your arms around. It's a new topic and it's a lot to understand.
Agreed. I think that, the feedback we're hearing today, your feedback, Jerry, is fairly consistent with what I'm seeing in my clients. I think as we look 24 to 36 months in the future, I'm expecting to see a heavier prevalence in column D of the respondents, because I think there's going to be additional pressure from shareholders, from proxy advisory firms to really get your arms around this. And as I say, to really have it identified in a charter or have a standalone committee that is tasked with overseeing this. But again, I'm not surprised to see that the vast majority of respondents are kind of falling in bucket B and C. I would say those that are in B probably need to start moving to C. And Tim, I saw you just come off mute. Anything you'd add here?
Yeah, the only thing that I would point out is when I think about creating potentially a new committee, I think a lot of that might be driven by the industry in which we're operating in. If I think about, banking and finance, where cybersecurity is wildly important, I do think down the road we'll see some pretty big differences between, a manufacturing company and, a banking company, and how their board structured and what committees they have in place to kind of tackle and oversee some of these areas.
Yeah, great point, Tim. I think there's certainly, once this all shakes out, I certainly think we're going to see some industry bias to this data, depending on, where you fall. Obviously, cybersecurity will be more pronounced in finance, banking, areas where, that kind of information is extremely valuable and important. I think you're going to see an additional focus. But as I said, I anticipate if we run this polling question in the next year, we'll see a heavier reliance on C and D, and that will only continue as we push forward. Next slide, please. This is just kind of giving you guys a graphic representation of when we look, and for those of you that are familiar with the NACD Director Comp report, this shouldn't come as a surprise, but essentially when we look at Board of Director Comp data, we bifurcate it by size. The size groups we use are shown here. So micro, which is a 50 million to a 500 million revenue company, small, which is 500 million to a billion, a medium cut, that's a billion to 2.5 billion, large, that's 2.5 to 10 billion, and then your top 200, which are the largest 200 companies in the S&P 500. We do a lot of diligence internally at Pearl Meyer to make sure that the sample sizes in each of these categories are consistent year to year, meaning the percentages generally don't vary too dramatically year to year. And we try to keep, to the extent possible, the same companies in each bucket, unless they've moved based on a size consideration. So we do spend a lot of time at Meyer and working with NACD to make sure, again, when we're looking at kind of year-over-year changes on these specific categories, we're as apples to apples as humanly possible. So as we go through this presentation, you'll see a lot of the data will be bifurcated under the pretense of these size categories, and this is just to provide line of sight to what those size categories really are.
Yeah, the one thing I would add, Ryan, is we go through the data. Most of it is broken down by size organizations, but we don't necessarily talk about differences by industry. For the most part, I would say, industry plays has a lesser impact on, some compensation levels and design, but certainly in some areas, the industry does matter. For those of you that are curious and, compensation levels are designed by industry, that is all information we have. So you can feel to reach out to Meyer and Ryan and I, and, we're happy to, work with you to provide you with some more industry specific data if needed.
Yeah, great point. The NACD report in this presentation today is largely built around size. There's not an industry focus to it, but to Tim's point, unlike executive comp, you see a little bit less dichotomy from an industry perspective on director comp. You generally see a lot of companies not wanting to lead or lag the market necessarily. So everyone kind of aggregates around a fairly tight median, unlike executive compensation, which can have a pretty wide array of outcomes. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're looking across kind of all 5 size categories, as well as a kind of all aggregate firm summary at the bottom. But if you look at the 2023 year in terms of growth in median total direct compensation per director, obviously most pronounced at the micro level. That tends to generally be the case historically as you've looked at this. If you look in aggregate, all firms about 4%. If you look historically, somewhat in line, we are seeing a little bit more pronounced increases in 23 than we've seen over the last few years, especially coming out of COVID and some other things. I think that's a result of some normalization post-COVID, as well as some of the items that we raised on that earlier slide when we spoke to the environment, just the general understanding that there's more scrutiny. There's a little bit more time commitment anticipated given the additional remit on certain items. And, as a result of that, I think you're finding the pool of directors becoming a little bit shrinking a little bit. And as a result, it's forcing some pay levels. And as I said, I've said this for a few years and it hasn't come to fruition. So I'm going to bang the drum again in 2024 and see if it comes to fruition. But I would think you're going to start seeing these. I never think you're going to see double-digit increases in these, but I do think you could start seeing larger single-digit year-over-year increases, especially as I say, as we try to recruit some non-traditional directors into the director space that have experience in things like cybersecurity and AI. You're probably going to find, as I say, some companies using director comp to help create some differential for, recruiting talent in that space. Now, as I said, it hasn't come to fruition yet, but I'm holding hope that we're going to start seeing those numbers. But as I said, 4% in 2023 is the biggest jump we've seen since 2017. So again, a little bit more pronounced than we've seen over the last couple of years. Next slide. This is a slide that I really want to kind of focus on 2 areas, largely this idea of mandatory retirement age and this viewpoint of gender diversity. We've talked somewhat on gender diversity over the last couple of years, and this is not a new phenomenon by any means, but we are certainly seeing an uptick in the amount of female directors that are serving on boards. We have a very high prevalence now kind of across all size cuts of 2+ female directors and even 3+ female directors. So again, we have seen, this isn't a new phenomenon, but something we're continuing to see uptick. And you can see we've had greater than 10% increases in the small category, in the large category, and the top 200 category across having more than 3 female directors. Again, from my perspective, being in the boardroom, I think this has been value add change. It brings a lot of different perspectives into the boardroom that 10 years ago might not have been there, quite frankly. I think the other aspect here is mandatory retirement ages. I certainly think we are seeing an increased focus, even though the prevalence of disclosure decreased slightly year over year. I would expect this idea of mandatory retirement continues to get scrutiny. And I might even say that mandatory retirement age at 75 starts to creep a little bit lower going forward. I could see it moving to that 70 age range. In fact, I have a couple of clients that shy away from 75. 75 is certainly the most prevalent. The other aspect of this that isn't represented on this slide, but we are starting to see a little bit more of, is kind of this idea of not necessarily a mandatory retirement age, but a max tenure kind of threshold, meaning once you've served 5, 6, 7, 8 years as an independent director, this idea of, are you really quote unquote an independent any longer? Are the lines somewhat blurred? And we've seen ISS and Glass Lewis and some proxy advisory firms push on board tenure. But I would expect some companies to start implementing additional things outside of mandatory retirement age to spur board refreshment. So, again, I think the key takeaways here are diversity is something that is not going away, and we continue to see growing. And from Pearl Meyer's perspective, has been a tremendous value add at the director level. And this idea, again, of board refreshment. How do we really facilitate effective board refreshment? Is it through mandatory retirement? Is it through these, 10-year maximums where you can't exceed a specific amount of service? I think we're going to see additional heightened diligence around both of those areas in the next couple of years, again, as we're looking to bring some fresh insights and ideas to the board. Again, Jerry, I'll kind of put you on the spot and say, is this reflective, the gender diversity, this idea of kind of board refreshment? Are you seeing, more rhetoric, more conversations at the board level about both of those topics?
Well, certainly gender diversity is a board topic and something that, we're held to a standard on also. So, we pay very close attention to that. The other thing that struck me as I looked at this slide to begin with is if you've got an average age of 63, forced retirement age of 75. So that's 12 years to go from a tenure, and you've already got 6 on the board. Well, that's 18 years.
Yes.
That he would be on the board. And that just, somewhere in that, and this is just me speaking, but somewhere in that 10 to 12 range feels like that's a long time to be on a board. And, and I feel like from a director standpoint, it's kind of like no different than when you're an executive. The closer you get to retirement, the less you want to retire for many people. And so this, and while in theory, refreshment, well, not just theory, but in actuality, board refreshment is an important topic. But the closer it gets to you from a personal level, the harder it gets to be. And I just find that whole tension there interesting to navigate. And so I think it will be fascinating if we watch boards move from a 75 to a 70, from a retirement age standpoint, because there does have to be some forcing, but of course boards can vote to increase it also. So it's just, it's a lot to think about and to maneuver within your own board without hurting people's feelings and doing the right thing on behalf of the shareholders and the company and everyone involved. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point you mentioned, Jerry, of kind of this tightrope that you need to walk in terms of, forced retirement, mandatory retirement. And, to your point, I've seen it play out in clients where somebody gets to be 75 and they look up and they're not ready to retire, but the board is ready for them to retire. And it can create some animosity in that regard. And I think you're right, the dichotomy between median director age and this retirement age, again, brings you back to that idea, is that retirement, that mandatory retirement, more of a governance box check, or is it something that we're really utilizing to enforce this idea of refreshment? And I think the companies that are really using it to look at it through the lens of refreshment will probably be reevaluating that age requirement and maybe, as I said, layering in additionally kind of this 10-year maximum saying, look, if you, and I believe ISS is like a 9-year, once you've hit 9 years, they start looking at it saying, so something of that ilk. And I know, again, proxy advisory firms have been putting additional pressure on that. So I wouldn't be surprised to see companies starting to acquiesce and implement some more proactive measures in terms of board refreshment.
Something that one of my boards does, it's on this line, but a little bit different, is if you're going to chair a committee, you can't chair the committee for any more than 5 years. And so there's a mandatory turnover from a chair standpoint, which I think is excellent from like a board succession planning, right? And getting more people involved in leadership responsibilities. And so I think that level of forced change is very healthy inside the boardroom.
100%. Yeah, I've seen it anywhere from 3 to 5 years, Jerry, to say, look, you can only be the chair of a committee or something. And 100%. And I think this idea of board succession and understanding what it takes to be in that leadership role is critically important. And I've had clients that have struggled with that in the past because they've gone, well, we need to change, but I'm not sure we have someone that's a viable candidate to, let's say, be the comp committee chair or be the audit committee chair. So 100% agree. I think succession planning, and that's a different topic, but succession planning, even at the board level, is going to be something that you're going to start see a heightened focus on as we move forward. I think that takes us to our next poll question, if I'm not mistaken, which it does. So the next poll question that we're hoping you'll opine on is, what does your board have in place to enhance board refreshment? Established age limits, tenure limits, both age and tenure limits, or D, none of the above?
While we wait for the polling to come through, I'll tell you that on both of my boards, we have age limits, and we set our age at 72.
Okay.
So, we'll see how that changes over time. But
well, you're moving in the right direction, Jerry. You guys are moving in the right direction. So, yeah, but we'll see. As I said, I wouldn't be surprised to see that number start to creep down as we continue to move forward. So I'm seeing, a pretty good smattering of A, B, C with about half in the D. So about half and half with some defined approach to board refreshment, and then D, none of the above. I will go back to the point that Jerry mentioned earlier. The conversations around board refreshment can become difficult when the individual, as I say, is not necessarily ready. It becomes easier when you have a policy in place that you can point to say, look, this is why we're going through this process. Not that we don't like you, not that you're not doing a great job, but we have this policy in place and everybody lives with it. So again, those in the D category, I would encourage you to think about A, B, or C in this, because as I said, I think when push comes to shove and you get to that point of that refreshment, it becomes a much easier conversation when you're speaking to a company-wide policy rather than something that is you're more pulling out of thin air and saying, look, we just feel like it's time for a board refreshment. So I would encourage those that haven't contemplated this idea of board refreshment and how to facilitate that to think a little bit more thoroughly about, is it an age limit, is it a tenure limit, is it a combination of the two, but to put something in place that's a little bit more formal, because I do believe at the end of the day it makes that process an easier process to facilitate. Next slide, please. This is just looking at kind of cash and equity retainers for all firms. So again, we're looking at all size cuts here. There's no bifurcation based on size. It's all companies reporting in. Again, we're seeing a pretty big jump in median annual cash retainers. We've seen a slight year-over-year increase in median average committee compensation and a fairly significant decline in board meeting fees. I think even though we've seen a little bit of an uptick in year-over-year committee compensation, at least from my perspective and what I've seen with a lot of my clients and in this data set quite a bit, is that companies are taking a simplified approach to director compensation. I think the idea is, given the additional remit that's falling at various committees that we talked about earlier in the conversation, the workload is starting to normalize across all committees. You used to kind of have this pecking order that it was audit, comp, nom and gov, kind of in that order. I think you're starting to see the lines blurred a little bit there. So I think you're starting to see a lot of firms move away from incremental committee compensation with the idea that we're just going to bake it in to the annual cash retainer, acknowledging the fact that the workload, the scrutiny is starting to kind of equalize across all the committees. I think regarding meeting fees, this isn't a new phenomena, something we've been talking about for at least the last 5 years. But again, from a simplicity of administration, also from kind of keeping away from this lumpiness that can occur in director compensation when you have meeting fees. I've had a lot of companies that move away from the meeting fees with the idea that let's just take that value that we were delivering through meeting fees and bake it in to the annual cash retainer. It mitigates these conversations of, well, did that constitute a meeting? You know, we got on the phone, a phone call for 15 minutes and had a conversation. Was that a meeting? Are we getting paid for that? So I think that's not something we expect to come back in any way, shape, or form. I think meeting fees are something that are going to go away in large part. Now, sometimes they have a place if you have a special committee that's there for a specific point in time that is, you know, an M&A committee or something, a succession committee, something that's working on a very specific topic. There might be a rationale for a meeting fee at that point in time, especially if they're meeting on a very regular type of basis. But outside of that, I think Pearl Meyer's perspective is we're generally not huge proponents of meeting fees. And again, I think, you know, the increase in equity awards, again, I think that's fairly aligned with what we're seeing across market is, you know, again, the emphasis in these compensation programs at the director level tend to be on median rather than on equity rather than cash. So I would expect, again, you're going to continue to see upticks in equity values as shareholders are looking to create more alignment between themselves and the board of directors. So again, you know, since over the 5 years, we've seen a 15% jump in median total direct compensation. So about a 3-year on average, and about a 15% jump in aggregate total board cost. So again, potentially seeing these numbers jump a little bit more in the future, but I think the major takeaways here is simplification of director comp, largely delivered through annual cash or annual equity retainers, with a movement away somewhat from incremental committee compensation and a significant shift away from meeting fees, just under the pretense that we can deliver largely the same compensation in a much more administratively friendly manner. And I don't anticipate those trends to reverse anytime soon. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my esteemed colleague, Tim, who will walk you through the remainder of the materials.
Great, next page. So here we're looking at the total compensation provided to the directors by company size, and just generally provides a breakdown of how that pay is delivered. So similar to executive compensation, the total direct compensation for a board member is highly correlated with the size of the company. So you can see, you know, about $150,000 in total at the micro companies, all the way up to, you know, $323,000 of top 200. The light blue bars represent the value that is being delivered in restricted stock or full value shares. And so really across the board, across all size companies, this is the primary delivery vehicle of, you know, board of directors compensation. So a focus on equity over cash. And as you know, we see in all of the data that plays out, that equity being delivered in full value shares versus stock options, which represents those yellow bars, or the yellow part of each of the bars. And then committee compensation, you know, is generally a pretty small portion of each board member's pay package. And once again, you know, kind of goes back to what Ryan's been talking about, you know, in terms of simplifying the pay package. Pay package primarily delivered in cash, annual retainer, the dark blue bars at the bottom, and then kind of full value or equity awards with the light blue bars.
And just adding one thing to what Tim said is if you look at the micro group where you see a little bit more pronounced use of stock options, again, not something we typically recommend. Generally, it creeps in a little bit heavier at that micro level just because stock prices tend to be pretty nominal for a lot of those companies. And if you think of a value-based delivery model, which is most of the time how equity is delivered at the board level, it becomes quite difficult to deliver substantial value at a small share price to directors without depleting your shares available to grant. So you go through quite a bit. So what companies at that micro level do theoretically is provide a little bit more options with the idea that the upside might be a little bit higher. But again, the grant date value is fairly nominal. So that's why you see that 7%. But again, stock options, not a preferred equity vehicle for board comp from our perspective.
Yep, totally agree, Ryan. Next page. Here we're looking at the prevalence of companies, across the different size categories and in all firms. Of those companies that are delivering more than 50% of the compensation to their directors in the form of equity. This has been an increasing trend, clearly for the last 10 years of having a very strong focus on equity compensation. If I think about, this report back in 2017 or 2018, I think that's about the time frame where we saw across all size companies, the prevalence was at least 50%, and it just continues to grow. So even looking at all firms, in basis in those bar columns to the right, 81% of all companies in our survey or report are delivering more than 50% of total direct compensation in the form of equity. And once again, that is just a desire to further align, the director compensation with the shareholder interest. Next slide. So if we think about how that equity is being delivered, and once again, looking at the all firms column here, with 95% of companies in our report providing an annual equity award to their directors, it is the vast majority of those companies are delivering that in the form in a fixed value arena where they are delivering a set number of dollars in terms of equity every year. So let's say every year we're going to grant $50,000 worth of equity to our directors. Less common, but obviously the second most prevalent approach here is a fixed share approach, where rather than say we're going to deliver $50,000 in terms of equity to our directors, we're going to grant a fixed number of shares or 10,000 shares. I am hearing that we lost audio. Okay, and we're back. So I'll take a quick step back. The most common approach in delivering equity is a fixed value approach, where you're delivering a consistent year-over-year value in terms of dollars. Some companies provide a fixed share approach, where rather than saying we're going to deliver $50,000 worth of equity every year, we're going to grant 10,000 shares to each of our directors every year. The rationale for companies that are using a fixed value approach is that it really comes to the overall governance and the purpose of a board of directors in saying that, we don't overvalue or undervalue the purpose of our board in stages of declining or increasing stock price. So we want to be consistent year over year in making sure that the compensation that we're providing to our directors, remains competitive with the market. If we go to the next page, this kind of leads us into our next polling question. Oh, was I off on the polling question? Oh, I'm sorry. So we'll get to the polling question in a minute. One of the things that comes with directors getting a significant amount of compensation in equity is it is a best governance practice. It's an NACD best practice. It's certainly a prevalent practice to have stock ownership guidelines in place as well. We can see that 80% of organizations in our report have some sort of stock ownership guidelines in place, and they're definitely far more prevalent in larger organizations than they are in smaller organizations. The definition of the ownership requirement is usually defined as a multiple of the annual cash retainer, ranging from 3x the cash retainer at micro companies to 5 times in medium, large, and top 200 companies. And with those stock ownership guidelines, generally companies have a time period in place for those ownership requirements to be met. And we can see across the board here, the most prevalent time period for those guidelines to be met is 5 years. In addition to stock ownership guidelines, it's not a overly prevalent practice. We can see about 34% of companies also have what we call holding requirements, which essentially prohibits a director to sell their stock that they've been granted until certain milestones have been met. The most common milestone is until the ownership requirements are achieved, or those ownership guidelines are achieved as we described above. So a director cannot sell their shares until they have met that ownership guideline of 3 to 5%, 5 times their cash equity retainer. In the top 200 companies, a slightly less prevalent approach, but certainly quite common, is those directors are required to hold their equity until retirement. Next slide. So when we think about, a couple slides ago, we talked about how companies are delivering the equity in terms of whether it's fixed value or fixed share approach. And I'll be interested in Ryan and Jerry's input here. But we have heard some companies kind of discussing based on how their stock price is moving and how the stock price volatility plays into share usage. If they have a fixed value approach and we see a pretty big decline in stock price, that means you're granting more shares to deliver the same value, which obviously causes the use of more equity. And so our next polling question is, how has stock price volatility impacted the way you think about the board's annual equity grant? And we've laid out 3 options here. We have recently moved or are discussing moving from a fixed share approach to a fixed value approach. We have recently moved or are discussing moving from a fixed value approach to a fixed share approach to conserve shares, or no impact, our current approach is working great, or we just haven't been subject to some of the stock price volatility that some other organizations have.
It looks like no impact is the predominant answer, Tim. This is an interesting question, because I think if we had looked at this, 12 months ago, you might have had more people we've recently moved or discussing moving to a fixed share approach from a fixed value approach. I had a number of clients, given, as you say, that kind of this volatility in stock price, just stepping back and saying, geez, if we grant the director shares on a value basis consistent with how we have historically, we're going to be spending 3x the amount of shares given our stock price. And some of those companies reverted to kind of a fixed share approach, more as a band-aid solution probably than a long-term solution, meaning let's do it until we get back into kind of a normalized stock price kind of rhetoric in terms of it's not bouncing up and down daily. But again, I'm not surprised, especially given how the market's performed over the last 6 to 8 months, that we're seeing no impact, but it is something that, I have seen more prevalent, let's say a year or so ago than now, but something that was certainly a hot topic, which is kind of this idea of, do we shift away from this, fixed share or fixed value approach to more of a fixed share approach until our stock price stabilizes?
Yeah, I agree. I've run into similar situations, and a couple of the situations were more in light of, hey, we are slowly running out of shares and we can't get to shareholders to ask for more shares until the next year. We had a pretty sharp decline in our stock price within the past month or two. What do we do about our director grant for this coming year? And so I agree, mostly a Band-Aid approach in that regard.
Yeah.
So yeah, no impact there. I think 85% of you kind of landed on number C there. So good discussion though. Next slide. So this on this slide, we're looking at committee chair compensation levels across different size organizations. What our data is showing here, I think, is a little different than kind of what Ryan discussed. We're experiencing, anecdotally in some of our clients. There is still the data shows that there's still certainly differentiation between how much an audit committee chair is being paid versus a comp committee chair versus a nominating governance committee chair. The data shows that difference is still there. I suspect, similar to what Ryan says, over the next few years, I do think we're going to see a more leveling out of these bars as we think about the additional roles and responsibilities that, a lot of compensation committees are overtaking in terms of ESG, maybe DE&I, succession planning or leadership development. But the data from our most recent study is showing that audit committee chairs are still being paid more than comp committee chairs, and comp committee chairs are still being paid more than nom-gov chairs.
Yeah, I think at the chair level, you're still seeing this dichotomy. I think that it's even muted a little bit from where it might have been 2 to 3 years ago. But I do think when you go to the next slide and you look at the committee member, that, look at the top 200, there's not even enough prevalence to provide you, viable summary statistics in terms of that dichotomy. And there's just not that many companies that are providing, that incremental committee service. So I think, to your point, Tim, I agree. I think it's more in the membership rather than the chair, because I still for an audit committee chair, there's an expertise that needs to be there that you're going to get a premium for. So there's always going to be some dichotomy there. I agree. I think it's going to mute over time, but it's certainly more pronounced on the committee member side.
No, I totally agree. And I think more interesting on this slide than the actual levels of the committee member retainers that are being paid is the prevalence. The prevalence, if we were to look at these prevalence numbers over the last 3 to 5 years, they have come down fairly drastically. I think back in 2018, when I was looking, a lot of these prevalence levels were, around 70-75%. So that comes back to, a point that Ryan made earlier. Companies really moving towards more of a simplified, administratively less burdensome approach to board pay, understanding that the board responsibility, the amount of work being put in by all board members is increasing kind of across the board and not just at the committee member level. As we move into the next slide, that brings us to our last polling question. And we talked about this a little bit, but given some of the increased areas of responsibilities and oversight of the board, what is your board's current thinking as it relates to established committees? So we have talked about ESG, DE&I, AI, cybersecurity. option A, we have recently created new committees to focus on some of these areas. This potentially overlaps with one of our earlier questions. B, we are discussing the potential of new committees. Or C, we're currently able to effectively oversee all of these additional areas within our current structure. So just looking kind of at the live results, it looks like a little less than between a half and 2/3 are falling in column C, where these additional kind of oversight and responsibilities that have been brought onto the board are being kind of put into the current committee structure, with about the other 2/3, less, just slightly more than half, falling evenly between A and B here. So Ryan and Jerry, a question for you. When you're talking to your clients about new committees, what are the main areas of oversight for some of those new committees? Are they special committees at this point that maybe are less specific in what they may oversee, or are they more tactical?
I mean, I've seen a more tactical. So, a cybersecurity committee or a DE&I committee. I'd say it's the prevalence of that is much. So I'm not surprised to see the responses in the room. That would have been my guess. I do just go back to the issue we mentioned earlier about committee charters. For those of you in the C category, I would make sure when you look at those committee charters that you're effectuating the fact that those committee charters are, in fact, effectively overseeing those other issues.
Mhm.
But, I think the creation of new committees is somewhat industry specific. Back to I have ESG committees in some companies that are very environmentally challenged, meaning they're just in businesses that are difficult from an environmental perspective. So they'll have an ESG committee because it's an important enough topic. But I would say the vast majority are in this kind of the C bucket, with some in that B bucket, which is very reflective of the group.
So I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So I think we'll just quickly touch on the next page. We talk about leadership compensation. Non-executive chairs tend to have a larger compensation than a lead director or presiding director. Typically, the non-executive chair, is paid about 1.5x versus a typical director, where we're looking at about a 13% premium for a lead director, where there is a non-exec chair in place. So maybe we can just move into the Q&A.
Well, maybe do we want to hit the private company slide just quickly? We might just want to spend a little bit. We have obviously the focus of the conversation. We'll keep this very quick. Has been largely focused on publicly traded firms under the size categories that we talked about, but we do a lot of private company director pay as well, and it's a hot topic because we're finding private companies are now starting to compete with public companies in terms of director talent. So again, equally concerned about appropriate director pay and recruiting high caliber board members, something that wasn't quite as prevalent 5 or 6 years ago in the private company sector. Large private companies are often competing with public companies for director talent. Many private companies boards are looking to public boards as best practice blueprint. Now, again, there is a lack of good market data on private company compensation, director compensation. So what we generally do is heavily leverage the Meyer NACD report as a primary data source for setting those pay levels. May use a data cut that is similar industry size. Again, to Tim's point earlier, size specificity more important than industry specificity. Will typically target director pay, depending on their philosophy, somewhere between the 25th and 50th percentile of the cash compensation of public companies. Most of the time when I do this, my private companies are aiming to have cash compensation that is consistent with their public company counterparts. The dichotomy is generally in the equity piece. And this targeting position reflects the differences in responsibility, largely governance between private and public company directors. So again, the delta is usually, at least in my experience, largely driven by that equity piece, where the cash compensation is largely consistent between private and public company boards. With that, let's go to the Q&A. I know we're short on time, so
So
yeah.
Ryan, That was one of the questions that came through on the Q&A, was the similarities and differences between a public and private company board of director pay. So is what you're saying is that cash to cash would be fairly equal, but then, but because there's no equity to be granted, then how do you make up that difference on the equity side? Does it just go away, or is there some portion of it that's added back on cash? Or
it generally goes away. And you know, I'm generalizing because I work with private companies that are very early stage private companies that have a board of director that don't want to provide cash. They only want to provide equity. So a lot of it's contingent upon your stage of evolution as a private company. As I would say, an established privately held company is generally providing their board with cash compensation that is largely consistent with their public company counterparts, and usually not addressing the equity portion. So usually when I'm looking at private company board comp, I'm looking to say, are we competitive on a cash basis with public companies of our similar size? And I generally will strip out the equity piece. Now, again, it differs based on the company that I'm looking at and what they're trying and their cash position and all of these other things. But I would say for established privately held companies, that's generally the approach.
I think we're going to have time for one more question. So the other question is, given the changing dynamics in the market, how often should director comp be reviewed? And I'm going to add to that question, be reviewed and changes made. As you know, I can tell you that on both of my boards, we review every year just to see where we are in relation to the peer set, but we don't have a cadence that we will make a change every year. We look at it maybe every other year to make a change, depending on how much the market has moved. And I don't know if that's what you see with your clients too.
I think, and I'll let Tim speak to this too, but I think, Jerry, that's pretty consistent. I call it kind of a look every year. One year is kind of what I'll deem as a light touch, and the other year will I'll deem as kind of a deep dive approach. You know, again, as we talked about, the movement in director comp is somewhat muted year to year. So generally, unlike executive comp, there's not necessarily a need to make annual changes unless there's been something that's changed dramatically from a business perspective, or you've had acquisitive activity in the company's and there's a different dynamic. But generally, I would say changes on an every other year basis, with an eye just to make sure that nothing strange has happened in the market that we're not privy to. So, you know, a light touch on an annual basis with a deep dive kind of every other year.
Okay, we turn it back to Mari.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm sorry that we could not get to all those questions because there's just too much great content, right? So I do want to remind our folks that are watching that if we didn't get to your question, and there's quite a few of those, that thankfully we will be able to respond back to you. Our friends at Meyer will be able to respond to you back via email. But one of the things that I wanted to remind everyone is that I just wanted to let you know that our next webinar in the series will be happening April 23rd. It'll be at the same time, 2 p.m. So keep a lookout on our webinars page on NACD to go ahead and register for that. For those of you who attended, I want to remind you that you automatically receive that credit towards your fellowship or certification. And if you were able to respond to at least 2 of those 4 questions, we'll be able to go ahead and also provide you NASPA credits. I want to thank Jerry, Ryan, and Tim for this amazing presentation. I want to remind the folks that are watching that to please go ahead and fill out that post-webinar survey that'll pop up on your screen as soon as we end this the webcast. And also it'll be available in your emails afterwards if you don't have time right after this. We know your time is valuable. Your feedback is really important to us, and we want to make sure that we improve our program. So with that, this concludes our program. We thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you have a wonderful afternoon.